It goes without saying that Ghostbusters is one of the most enduring franchises of the 80s. In its heyday, it boasted 2 movies, an animated series that lasted for 7 seasons, and countless toys and other merchandising. And even in 2009, 20 years after the last feature film, a video game sequel featuring the voices of the original cast was a big deal. It's not hard to see its universal appeal. Similar to Back to the Future, it managed to effortlessly hit all the sweet spots at once. Cool action, impeccable comedy, iconic special effects, and even a bit of romance, allowing it to effortlessly cross demographics. It wasn't until I was an adult that I even realized that Ghostbusters was supposed to be funny. I was just obsessed with a bunch of guys with cool toys driving around in a cool car, busting cool ghosts. Admittedly, I was a bit young for the first wave of Ghostbusters mania, as I was born 2 years after the first film came out. It was the enduring cartoon series that first got me into it, although my obsession quickly led me back around to the films. Being a film critic even then, I quickly decided that the second film was the superior effort. Now, what insightful analysis led my 7-year-old brain to come to this conclusion? Well, the first film, with its occasional dark imagery, particularly when Dana and Lewis are transformed, scared me. The second film didn't scare me. But rather than admit that, it was easier just to say Ghostbusters 2 was a better film. As an adult, though, what is there to say about Ghostbusters 2? Well, a lot, actually. I can cover the obvious. Ghostbusters 2 on its own isn't really a bad movie at all. What it is, though, as part of a franchise, is a painfully by-the-numbers sequel.
Aren't you supposed to lie to me and kiss my butt?
It's as if Harold Ramis and Dan Aykroyd just had a Ghostbusters plot Mad Lib from the first film and filled in the blanks. I could give a plot and structure synopsis and you would really have no idea which film I was talking about. 3 scientists are down on their luck, working on their hobby of the supernatural, but getting no level of respect from the establishment. Meanwhile, Dana Barrett just happens to have the bad luck of being in close proximity to the focal point of the buildup of all negative spiritual energy while a dopey nerd unsuccessfully tries to win her affections. Just when things are looking pretty hopeless for the 3 scientists, a sudden appearance of malevolent spirits results in a big action scene, whereupon the day is saved, the scientists emerge victorious from behind closed doors, and a big montage ensues showing the Ghostbusters cleaning up New York's ghost problem and becoming heroes to the citizenry. Peter and Dana begin to kindle a relationship. Now a completed set of 4, the Ghostbusters put together the pieces linking the ghosts to Dana, but before they can intervene and just as everything goes down the drain, a governmental bureaucrat conspires to incarcerate the Ghostbusters. There's then another montage showing ghosts taking over New York, while Dana gets in over her head at the epicenter of the disturbance. With some timely assistance of the mayor, who kicks out the bureaucrat, the Ghostbusters are put back in action. And after a climactic battle with the villain involving a giant icon coming to life and walking through the streets of New York, and the covering of characters in a gooey substance, the day is saved, Peter and Dana kiss, and the theme music plays. I mean, come on, this is the exact same movie. Not only that, but it's almost like they had to go out of their way to contrive it in some places to make it the same, when it would have been easier to do something different. The whole reason the Ghostbusters were able to save the day in the courtroom and emerge triumphant exactly as they had done at the hotel was because they were stupid enough to jackhammer a giant hole in the middle of a busy street rather than just, I don't know, find an existing entrance to the tunnels, which is just what they do later in the movie. Not to mention that it had to be the original 3 Ghostbusters even though Winston was present for the trial and would have had no reason not to get involved, other than the fact that they had to make it like the first movie. And the mayor only had the opportunity to give the bureaucrat his comeuppance and give the Ghostbusters clearance to save the day, like in the first movie, because he'd poo-pooed them earlier when he had the chance to listen, despite the fact that he now should have known better. And really, Dr. Brian Doyle Murray honestly believes the Ghostbusters are crazy when they talk about ghosts? In a sequel to a movie where they save the day from ghosts. But you're telling me that the people of New York accept the Ghostbusters as heroes, then reject them as menaces, then accept them again, and in the midst of that, someone can really go, adults believing in ghosts? Such a thing can't be real! They must be crazy! That's like going to Metropolis and having the men in white coats follow up the guy who shouts out, "It's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman," with,
"A man in the sky? Get out of here, enough of your lies."
And I'm not necessarily talking about people believing the Ghostbusters are frauds. That makes sense. But this isn't that. If you believe they're frauds, you think they're talking about ghosts in order to con you to make money, not because they're insane. They're Ghostbusters. What else would they talk about?
Yeah, Egon thinks there might even be a tremendous breeding surge in the cockroach population.
Do the people of this city have the memory of a goldfish? Nope. They've just had their collective faces slammed into the reset button so we can do the same thing all over again despite the fact that it makes no sense. But I am not here to condemn Ghostbusters 2. As I said, it's not a bad movie. It's just the same movie as Ghostbusters, and frankly, Ghostbusters is better. And when your only identity is leeching off another movie's identity and you don't do it as well, you tend not to appear in a favorable light. But that's not to say that Ghostbusters 2 didn't do some good things. In fact, it did some things better than the original Ghostbusters. First and foremost, Ghostbusters 2 made much better use of Winston than the original film ever did. Remember that my initial exposure to Ghostbusters was through the TV series, and in it there were always 4 Ghostbusters. They were the stars. So when I first saw the movie, I was surprised that there were only 3 Ghostbusters to begin with, and that Ernie Hudson's name was at the bottom of the cast list when, in my mind, he shouldn't have been any lower than 4th. But I eagerly awaited Winston's appearance. After all, the Ghostbusters weren't complete without him. But the older I got, the more I realized that, aside from delivering my favorite line in the movie,
Ray, when someone asks you if you're a god, you say, yes!
Winston serves absolutely no purpose. Now, the powers that be have stated that the intention for Winston was to be both a receptacle for exposition, as well as a straight man foil for the group. Indeed, he was originally envisioned as being an ex-Marine who was far more qualified for the job than the original Ghostbusters were. But whatever their intentions were, none of that really comes through on screen. As for needing an info dump character, Winston was superfluous because the movie already had one, Peter. If you look at the big exposition scene when the Ghostbusters are in jail, it's Peter who's asking most of the questions.
For a moment, pretend that I don't know anything about metallurgy, engineering, or physics, and just tell me what the hell is going on.
There's really only one scene where Winston is the recipient of exposition, and you know which scene I'm talking about.
That's a big Twinkie.
After which, Peter walks down the stairs.
Tell him about the Twinkie.
What about the Twinkie?
And had the scene continued, we would have seen them having to give the same exposition to Peter because he fulfills the same role. As for Winston being the straight man, the voice of reason, those scenes are so few and far between and have so little bearing on the plot that they really don't serve any purpose. His most memorable scene is the one with Ray, where he posits the idea that the high level of ghosts is a sign of the apocalypse. It's a good scene, one of my favorites in the film, but it's also pretty superfluous when you get right down to it. In my opinion, Winston should have been introduced earlier in the film, at the same time Janine was. Just imagine this super competent ex-Marine or whatever having to watch in shock as his new bosses run like loons around the hotel, throwing over tables and causing untold amounts of property damage with their nuclear-powered weapons. It really would have made his function clear. But as the film stands, that function is really poorly defined. However, in Ghostbusters 2, probably in part by virtue of being there from the beginning and maybe due to the influence of the cartoon, Winston's role is much more integral. Most visibly, he was bumped up from an abysmal 8th billing to a slightly more respectable 6th, the actual titular Ghostbuster finally getting billed above their secretary. Obviously, he's still bizarrely absent from much of the first act and the courtroom battle, but aside from that, it really feels like there are 4 Ghostbusters now. Winston has more screen time to show off his deadpan straight man character.
It's always the quiet ones.
Has a few moments where he can get the job done or save the day, and even gets his own phobias and foibles explored in a comic manner. As opposed to the first movie, it really feels like the plot would not have been able to progress without his presence. I particularly love his chemistry with Ray. In both films, Winston's best moments come from scenes with him, and it makes sense they'd be good foils to one another, the scientific but childlike Ray contrasting with the level-headed Winston. Ultimately, though, his role is still a bit lacking. He never seems to be treated by the movie as an equal to the other 3, and we never really learn anything about his life outside of being a Ghostbuster, even when they're not Ghostbusters. But still, being the distant 4th Ghostbuster is a huge step up from that other guy who randomly joins the Ghostbusters. I also really enjoy Lewis's role. To me, he represents what I would have wanted overall in Ghostbusters 2, doing something different. I mean, yes, Louis Tully is still the same awkward nerd he was in the first film, that hasn't changed. But he's no longer fulfilling the same function, he's evolved. In the first film, his role was solely in conjunction with Dana's. He doesn't even really meet the Ghostbusters until the very end. And it's almost funny how his
Who does your taxes?
quip then leads into his role in this film where he becomes employed in that capacity. I also loved his complete ineptitude as the Ghostbusters' lawyer.
My guys are still under a judicial estrangement order. They could be exposing themselves.
And you don't want us exposing ourselves.
And he really seems to idolize them throughout, culminating in his own attempt to don the uniform at the end of the film. Of course, Lewis is also tangentially symptomatic of the opposite. Since he was moved in such a different direction, they seemed to feel compelled to make a brand new Lewis character to fulfill the Lewis role that Lewis had abandoned. And so we get Janos Poha, Dana's boss, who's comically inept, has an unrequited crush on Dana, and who unwittingly gets involved in the villain's scheme. That's not to say I didn't like the Janos character. Peter McNichol is hilarious in this role, and I love watching him whenever he's on screen. Yes! But there is very little difference in terms of function. It just would have been nice if all the characters had gotten new exciting roles like Lewis did, rather than just retreading the old roles. I mean, he even finally gets some action in this movie, courtesy of Janine. Or at least someone who is claiming to be Janine. I'm not really sure what happened, but considering that Janine was played by Annie Potts in both movies, the character couldn't be any more different. Her appearance seems to be based off her cartoon incarnation's second design for a reason I can't quite figure out. Unless it was the other way around, I'm not quite sure. I mean, they didn't make Harold Ramis blonde in the second film, but from her slightly dowdy, deadpan, snarker, New Yorker everywoman character in the first film, she's suddenly donning bright red hair and gaudy fur coats. She literally looks like a cartoon. I just don't get it. Were they trying to make sure no one recognized Potts from designing women? Well, aside from that, and because I have absolutely no shame in disclosing my personal quirks on the internet, I freely admit that as a child, I found her seduction of Lewis to be quite titillating. Oh.
Tonight?
And to this day, I can't help but find Annie Potts extremely attractive.
So you live alone?
I find myself a bit at odds, though, because in the first film, she was clearly trying to start something with Egon, and that was a staple in the cartoon as well, and I was always quite invested in their budding relationship and that continuity. I like both pairings for different reasons, and I guess that's probably because the Janines seem like almost different characters. I have a hard time seeing the first film's Janine going for Lewis.
Something very strange about that man.
But her second incarnation seems like a great match. And again, even though her complete change didn't make any sense, at least they were trying to do something different. The only problem is that seducing Lewis was really her only role. She really didn't have any screen time with the Ghostbusters at all in this film when she had plenty in the first film, which I guess would make her a reverse Lewis. Oh, geez, that sounded wrong. Please forget I ever coined the term reverse Lewis. Jack Hardemeyer and the Statue of Liberty are such obvious stand-ins for Walter Peck and the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man that I barely even need to cover them. I mean, the DVD menus, aside from the obvious rebranding, are exactly the same on both movies except that the Walking Marshmallow Man is replaced by the Walking Statue. It is slightly different in that Lady Liberty is on our hero's side, and more Nintendo is always a good thing, but it's obvious they were going for the same effect. Dana is clearly in the same role as before, but by adding in the focal point being her child, it made it seem not quite as unbelievable that she'd be at the center of all this again. It's not much, but it does help, and Sigourney Weaver's presence is always appreciated. Baby Oscar also resulted in a kinder, gentler Peter than the first movie, which may or may not have been as successful a portrayal as what we got in the first film, but at least his character's moving in some direction, so I applaud a more mature Peter simply on that basis. Peter's growth from a womanizing con man into attempting to be the man that Dana needs him to be is nice to see. And at times he really seems to be the most level-headed of the group, or certainly the only one who didn't suddenly become stupid, like in the scene where he seems to be the only one who realizes it's a terrible idea to walk into a fancy restaurant in your underwear, covered in slime, and yelling and screaming.
Boys, you're scaring the straights, okay?
That scene in itself, by the way, seems like a pretty contrived and random way to get the Ghostbusters arrested. Like in the first film. And finally, there's Slimer. The most popular of all Ghostbusters ghosts was known simply as the Onion Head ghost in the first film, but he became a mascot in the cartoon, eventually pulling a Fonzie by retitling the show with his own name, taking billing over the actual Ghostbusters. So it was obvious he'd have to have some role in the sequel. Thankfully, though, they didn't go overboard with it. He appeared in a few scenes doing his trademark gluttonous eating, helping out at one point, and getting a spot in the credits. But thankfully he didn't take over the movie or become the Ghostbusters' sidekick. Despite the fact that it serves as a massive reset button to the plot, I also really like getting to see the Ghostbusters out of business and doing other things. And they all do seem like natural extensions of their characters. Of course Egon would go back to research. Of course Peter would try to parlay his fame into a schlocky television gig. And of course Ray, the heart of the Ghostbusters, would hold on to the idea of being a Ghostbuster, even if just as a party entertainer, long after everyone else stopped caring. I loved the stuff with the slime and the concept behind it, but Vigo never really gelled as a villain as well as Gozer had. The final battle was also rather underwhelming. The everyone putting aside their negative feelings and singing together for the new year was nice, but the Ghostbusters role was reduced to lie on the floor and then shoot it until it dies. It certainly didn't pack the wallop of crossing the streams in the first film. Something I admire about Ghostbusters in general is how seamlessly the merchandising juggernaut worked. Not only was this an idea where all their outfits and weapons were instantly marketable as toys, but the trappings fit both in-universe and out-of-universe. The logo works as a brilliant bit of marketing for the movie, but it also works as a brilliant bit of marketing for the characters in the movie. Now, Batman, for example, works this way too, but you can never seriously have Batman walking around with a boombox playing his theme music. But for the Ghostbusters, that works too. Out of universe, the Ghostbusters theme is iconic, but it also makes sense that the actual Ghostbusters use that theme to promote themselves as well. And so I really like the second Ghostbusters logo because it serves that double function. Out of universe is telling moviegoers that it's a sequel. In universe, well, it really says something similar, that they're back or that they achieved a victory that allowed them to return. Sadly, though, once the franchise reaches a certain age, it does bank on nostalgia. The new video game, for example, which was supposed to be a sequel, didn't use the second logo or even create a third. Instead, it went back to the original logo because that's what was most familiar. And if a third movie ever does happen, expect that to be the same too. But I love the new logo, I love the darker uniforms, I love the Ecto-1A, and I love the slime blowers. So that's about all I have to say about Ghostbusters 2. I think with all the good ideas, funny jokes, better use of certain characters, and innovative new gadgets, it could have been remembered much more fondly than it was if only all those elements had been placed in a more original story. Especially with that tendency to make sequels to older franchises with nostalgia heavily in mind, if there ever is a Ghostbusters 3, whoever is in charge really needs to take lessons from Ghostbusters 2. The cartoon didn't last as long as it did by just rehashing everything we'd all seen before. A Ghostbusters 3, to be successful, has to do something new. As for Ghostbusters 2, if you haven't seen it, check it out. It is funny, it is exciting, it is certainly worth watching, but it's worth watching more as a collection of good moments than as a cohesive original Ghostbusters story.
But I didn't care, G. I just be then
Ghostbusters!
had trapped through their back, screaming,
Ghostbusters!
Ghostbusters attack.
Really ain't one. Boy, it smells like somebody took a big...
Busters of any G-H-O-S-T.